Rebecca Turner was not the mother anyone suspected. To neighbors, she was quiet, reserved, and often seen walking hand in hand with her little boy Caleb. But behind the closed doors of her modest apartment, cracks were beginning to show, signs of struggle, resentment, and secrets no one wanted to believe. When Caleb's small body was pulled from the calm waters of Lake Everwood, what seemed like a heartbreaking accident quickly unraveled into a chilling story of betrayal, hidden motives, and the unthinkable truth of a mother who turned against her own child. The town of Ridgewood had always been a place where families felt safe, where the air smelled of pine trees and the calm waters of Lake Everwood reflected the sky like a mirror. On that warm summer morning, everything appeared normal, almost idyllic. Joggers passed along the lakeside trail, children laughed in the distance, and boats glided slowly across the water. Nothing about the scene suggested that something dark was about to surface. As the hours slipped by, the serenity was broken by the sharp cry of a man running along the path. He had spotted something unusual near the shore, something small floating on the gentle ripples. At first, it seemed like a child's sneaker that must have slipped off during play, but when the jogger drew closer, dread sank into his stomach. The sneaker was not empty, and beneath the water's surface, a tiny hand drifted upward, pale and limp. Within minutes, authorities were called. Police officers, paramedics, and onlookers crowded the lakeside, their faces frozen with disbelief as the lifeless body of a child was lifted from the water. It was a boy, no older than 4, dressed in a t-shirt and shorts that clung heavily to his small frame. His hair was tangled with bits of lakeweed, his eyes closed as though he were merely asleep. The sound of radios crackling and whispers spreading through the gathering crowd created an atmosphere heavy with shock. Nobody expected a scene like this in their quiet community. Children played by this very lake every day. Parents trusted it as a safe place. Now, it had become the backdrop of tragedy. Police quickly identified the boy as Caleb Turner, a child known to many in the neighborhood for his shy smile and curious nature. He was just 4 years old, a little boy who should have had his whole life ahead of him. Officers began asking immediate questions. Had he wandered away while playing? Had he slipped on the rocks and fallen in? The possibility of a tragic accident seemed most likely at first, but there was an unease that crept in as the situation unfolded. Caleb's small body bore marks that didn't match the idea of a simple fall. As the medical examiner examined the scene, whispers began to spread. Parents clutched their children more tightly, watching with fearful eyes as police worked methodically. Some residents tried to reassure themselves that it had to have been an accident. After all, who could imagine anything more sinister in a town like Ridgewood? Yet even as they spoke, there was a sense that something about this discovery was not going to be explained so easily. By late afternoon, the lake was no longer filled with the sound of laughter and splashing water. Yellow police tape lined the shore, warning others to stay back. Reporters arrived with cameras, broadcasting live updates about the tragic discovery. The image of Caleb I.'s tiny sneaker floating against the gentle ripples replayed in everyone's minds. What had first appeared to be a normal summer day had now shifted into a nightmare. And though many believed the answers would be simple, the truth was only beginning to reveal itself. The death of Caleb Turner was not just an accident. It was the beginning of a story that would expose darkness where nobody expected it. When detectives began their search for answers, the first person they turned to was Caleb's mother, Rebecca Turner. At 29, she was known to neighbors as quiet, polite, and somewhat withdrawn. She lived in a small, modest apartment just a few miles from the lake, and though she often kept to herself, people saw her regularly walking with Caleb to the park or daycare. To many, she seemed like a mother doing her best under difficult circumstances. When officers knocked on her door, she appeared tired but composed, her voice steady as she recounted the events of the day. She explained that Caleb had wandered off while she was distracted, saying she had only looked away for a moment while unpacking groceries. Her words were clear, yet her tone lacked the panic many would expect from a grieving parent. Detectives noticed it immediately, but they didn't comment. At first, there was no proof to challenge her account, and cases like this often did begin as accidents. Children slipped into lakes, rivers, and pools every summer. Yet as investigators retraced Rebecca's steps, small cracks began to appear in her story. When asked what Caleb had been wearing before he disappeared, she hesitated as if trying to recall. When questioned about the timeline, she gave answers that shifted slightly each time. Though subtle, these inconsistencies stood out to seasoned officers trained to listen for the truth between the lines. The first major breakthrough came later that same evening. Surveillance cameras from a park located near the lake revealed footage that contradicted her version of events. At 10:42 a.m., Rebecca was seen walking hand in hand with Caleb toward the water. They remained near the shoreline for almost 20 minutes. She appeared calm, watching him as he played near the edge. Then, at 11:03 a.m., she walked away alone. Caleb did not follow. The footage was grainy, but the timeline was impossible to ignore. Rebecca had told police she never went near the lake that day, yet here she was on camera. Investigators returned to her apartment to question her again, this time more firmly. When shown the footage, Rebecca remained composed but adjusted her story. She claimed Caleb had begged her to visit the lake, that she left him there to play for a short while, and that she assumed he had followed her home. The explanation was thin, but she delivered it without hesitation. The detectives exchanged glances. The possibility of negligence crossed their minds, but something about her lack of visible emotion unsettled them. Parents in shock often broke down, replaying every detail through tears. Rebecca, however, seemed almost detached, as though she were telling someone else's story. As officers drove back to headquarters, they felt the weight of what they had uncovered. Caleb's death might not have been a simple accident after all. There was a mother whose story did not align with reality. A mother who had walked her child to the very lake where he was found lifeless only hours later. The evidence was still fragile, just fragments of suspicion, but it was enough to shift the investigation. The image of Rebecca walking away from the shoreline, leaving her son behind, would stay in their minds as they dug deeper. Something about her calmness, her careful but inconsistent answers, and her quiet departure from the lake suggested that what had happened was far more deliberate than anyone wanted to believe. The autopsy results were the turning point. When the medical examiner released the findings, the investigators' suspicions hardened into something more concrete. Caleb had not simply slipped beneath the water and drowned by chance. His lungs contained a large amount of water, confirming he was alive when he went under. But what disturbed the medical team most were the bruises on his small arms and shoulders. They were faint but distinct, the kind left by someone gripping tightly. These marks told a story of resistance, of a struggle in his final moments. Caleb had not wandered into the lake unattended. He had been forced into it, held there until he could no longer fight. The report spread quickly among the detectives, each one absorbing the chilling truth. What had begun as a tragic accident was now classified as a homicide. This revelation reshaped every aspect of the case. They began to view Rebecca Turner not as a grieving mother, but as the prime suspect in her own child's death. The question looming over everyone's mind was motive. Why would a mother commit an act so unthinkable? What could push someone to take the life of their own child? To answer these questions, the investigators began dissecting her past. Financial records revealed the first clue. Rebecca was drowning in debt. Overdue bills stacked high on her kitchen counter, collection agencies hounded her phone, and eviction notices hung over her head. She had applied for multiple life insurance policies in Caleb's name in recent months, each valued at several $1,000s. Alone, this discovery could have been dismissed as coincidence, but paired with the autopsy findings, it painted a grim picture. Detectives considered whether financial desperation had driven her to see her son not as her child, but as a means to escape her mounting problems. But the financial angle wasn't the only troubling piece of evidence. Social workers who had previously been involved with the family described an unsettling pattern. Caleb had been reported with unexplained bruises at daycare, though no formal case had ever been opened. Neighbors recalled nights when his cries echoed through the thin apartment walls, followed by silence. One neighbor admitted they had considered calling the authorities, but always assumed it was simply the stress of parenting. No one imagined the situation could escalate to something irreversible. As investigators pieced together these fragments, the portrait of Rebecca darkened. She was not simply overwhelmed by motherhood, she seemed resentful of it. Friends from her past shared that she often said her life had ended when she became a mother, that she felt trapped, unable to pursue the life she once dreamed of. These comments, dismissed at the time as venting, now took on a more sinister meaning. The investigators sat with the evidence, the autopsy report, the financial motives, and the troubling history. Each element fit into a narrative that no one wanted to accept, yet one that was becoming unavoidable. Caleb's death was not the random cruelty of fate. It was deliberate. He had been held beneath the water until his small body gave out, and the one person meant to protect him more than anyone else in the world was now the one accused of ending his life. For the detectives, there was no turning back. The case had shifted from tragedy to calculated crime, and every step forward would dig deeper into the darkness Rebecca had tried to conceal. The more investigators dug into Rebecca Turner's life, the more disturbing the details became. On the surface, she was a struggling single mother, someone who appeared to be quietly carrying the weight of her circumstances. But beneath that image was a trail of warning signs that now seemed impossible to ignore. Neighbors began to share memories that they had brushed off before. Some spoke of nights when Rebecca's raised voice echoed through the thin apartment walls, followed by the muffled cries of a child. Others recalled seeing Caleb outside with small bruises on his arms or legs, which Rebecca often explained away as playground accidents. These recollections, though vague at the time, now felt like pieces of a puzzle that revealed something darker. The daycare Caleb attended had its own records that raised alarm. Teachers remembered him arriving with visible marks more than once. When asked about them, Rebecca always had quick answers. He tripped, he fell, he bumped into furniture. At the time, the staff felt uneasy but lacked enough proof to take formal action. Now, those same explanations were viewed with suspicion. Caleb, it seemed, had been living in an environment where his safety was far from certain. Detectives also learned about Rebecca's emotional state in the months leading up to the tragedy. Friends described her as distant and resentful. She had once been social, but lately she avoided gatherings and rarely spoke to anyone outside of brief encounters. Some remembered her saying she felt stuck, and that motherhood had stolen her freedom. A co-worker from her part-time job recalled her admitting she regretted becoming a mother so young. None of those who heard such comments thought she meant them literally, but now those words carried a chilling undertone. When detectives confronted Rebecca with the inconsistencies in her story, her mask of calmness began to slip. She was shown the surveillance footage from the park once more, the recording that captured her walking Caleb to the lake and returning alone. At first, she stuck to her explanation, insisting she left him to play for a few minutes. But as questions pressed harder, her responses became defensive. She contradicted herself, changing small details, claiming she thought he was following behind her, then later saying she believed someone else had been watching him. Each new statement only deepened the suspicion. The most damning moment came when investigators revealed the financial records. The life insurance policies stood out as more than coincidence. Rebecca tried to claim she had taken them out as a form of protection, a way to secure her son's future. Yet the timing, so close to her financial collapse, was difficult to explain away. The evidence suggested a chilling possibility, that she had not only planned for her son's death, but intended to profit from it. Though Rebecca never confessed, her behavior and the mounting evidence left little doubt in the minds of investigators. She had taken Caleb to the lake under the guise of an ordinary outing, a chance for him to play and enjoy the day. Instead, she forced him into the water, held him there as he struggled, and walked away once the life had left his small body. The act was deliberate, calculated, and cold. For detectives, the realization was devastating. They had uncovered not just a crime, but a betrayal of the most sacred bond between a mother and her child. The trial of Rebecca Turner became one of the most closely followed cases the town of Ridgewood had ever witnessed. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse from the very first day, cameras flashing as Rebecca was escorted inside in a prison jumpsuit, her wrists bound in cuffs. The sight of her walking calmly, eyes forward without visible remorse, unsettled everyone who gathered to watch. To many, she no longer looked like a grieving mother, but like someone who had carefully hidden her intentions until the truth caught up. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy, the silence broken only by the shuffle of papers and the voices of attorneys preparing to argue what had really happened to 4-year-old Caleb Turner. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their evidence. They began with the surveillance footage, the grainy video that showed Rebecca leading Caleb to the lake and returning alone. It was simple yet powerful, a silent record of a moment that contradicted every claim she had made to police. Then came the autopsy report, described in detail by the medical examiner. The bruises on Caleb's arms, the water in his lungs, the undeniable signs that he had struggled. These were the facts that no explanation could soften. Jurors shifted uncomfortably as the doctor spoke, the weight of those final moments pressing heavily on the room. Financial records were presented next, each document carefully displayed, showing the life insurance policies Rebecca had applied for in Caleb's name. Prosecutors argued that her financial troubles, paired with her growing resentment of motherhood, created a motive that was as chilling as it was tragic. To drive the point home, witnesses were called. Neighbors testified about hearing arguments and cries from the apartment. Daycare workers spoke of unexplained bruises. Friends and acquaintances recounted Rebecca's complaints about feeling trapped and ruined by her role as a mother. Every testimony added another layer, building the picture of a woman who no longer wanted the child she was supposed to protect. The defense attempted to counter the narrative, painting Rebecca as a deeply depressed and overwhelmed parent who had not been in her right mind. They argued that her actions were the result of untreated mental illness rather than malice or greed. But the jury had little sympathy in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Depression might explain her struggles, but it could not erase the careful planning of life insurance policies. Nor could it account for the bruises that showed Caleb had been held down. Throughout the proceedings, Rebecca remained emotionless. She rarely looked up, rarely reacted, and gave the impression of someone detached from the gravity of her own trial. This silence, rather than helping her, only deepened the perception of her coldness. When closing arguments were made, the prosecution framed her as a mother who had turned against her own child for money, and the defense pleaded for understanding of her fragile mental state. The jury deliberated for 2 days before delivering their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the decision aloud, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of muffled sobs from observers who had followed the case from the beginning. Rebecca showed no reaction, her face still blank, as though she were listening to a story that had nothing to do with her. For the people of Ridgewood, the outcome brought a mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, yet it did little to ease the ache of a life cut short. Lake Everwood, once a symbol of peace and childhood joy, would never feel the same again. Parents who once let their children play freely by the shore now kept them close, glancing at the water with unease. The story of Caleb Turner lingered in the town's memory, a haunting reminder of innocence betrayed. His name became a symbol of the community's grief, and his story a cautionary tale that darkness can sometimes hide in the places people least expect. The ripples from that single act spread far beyond the lake, leaving scars that time alone could never fully erase.